you and I have never met in person. We've just followed each other online for some time. And I feel a real synchronicity with you. I write to make sense of the world around me, and I get the sense that you probably do too. And I think we've both made a career out of talking about things that we don't typically tend to talk about. And to get to know you, I've been listening to the audiobook of The World is a Nice Place, which I have absolutely inhaled in the last few days. But I've deliberately avoided Wife Interrupted, which was your first book, the one that kind of put you on the map, even though I am desperate to read it, because I get this feeling that that chapter of your life was a small but very potent part of your story. And I'd love to invite you for people listening, to tell them what I'm talking about, but then also tell me, how do you feel about that part of your story now?
It's so interesting because even The World is a Nice Place. Like, I don't know about you as someone who writes like inspired by their own experiences. As soon as I create a piece of content, it feels old. Like even The World is a Nice Place, I wrote that book before I became a mother. So like it feels like that's a different season of my life. And then Wife Interrupted was literally like 17 years ago, which is insane. But even the stuff I write yesterday feels like is not me as at today. So, you know, even whenever someone says like all the lovely things they say about any of my books, it feels like they're complimenting or saying it about like an older version of me. But yeah, none more true than Wife Interrupted, which was, for people that don't know, the book I wrote immediately after my first husband died when I was 23. And I wrote this book. We were married for 3 weeks. We knew that he was going to die, or we had been told that he was going to die when we got married. He died 3 weeks after our wedding day. And then I basically wrote a journal in the next year of how I coped as a 23-year-old widow, thrust into this shared house in London with 3 other girls in their 20s, and just started sleeping around, like dealing with all my feelings by, you know, doing what 20-year-olds do when they're heartbroken, which is, you know, to get over one guy, get under another guy. But of course, when you're a widow, that's not exactly what you are meant, in quotes, to do. But I wrote this very out there, very deeply uncensored book about my experience, which was the first book I ever published, Wife Interrupted. And it takes the reader up to a year after my husband died. So certainly not into any kind of recovered state, still in the rawness of recovery. And yeah, it ended up being a very controversial book when it came out all those years ago, because people weren't talking about like the messy side of grief. Like all the self-help books around grief and loss were like, these are the 10 steps and this is what you're going to go through. And they were all very much written for like, you know, people who'd been married to their partners for 30 years and had kids and were at the, you know, in the final quarter of their life. They weren't aimed at a 20-year-old. So yeah, ever since then, I've kind of been documenting on and off what it's like to have a life after loss, and exactly what we were talking about, what it's like to allow yourself to become more than one event that happens to you. But also, whilst acknowledging that grief is a lifelong journey and there is no end point. So, you know, I am married again very joyfully. I have 3 beautiful kids. But, you know, it doesn't mean that there's a full stop on that grief, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So even in my own writing, how to still mention it without over-identifying with it, how to acknowledge it without ignoring it, as a content creator is a really interesting dance, which I'm sure you are absolutely in the midst of yourself.
I really am. And I identify with so much of what you said. I feel the same about all of my projects. And I think that as a creative and as a type A personality or as a perfectionist, I could iterate forever and never put anything out there. And I have to get to a point with all of my work where I'm like, that's good enough, push it out there and then be okay with the impact of that. We're going to dive into some of the reaction to the book and also some of the, I suppose, the ways in which you self-soothed in response to that grief. But first, I just want to understand, what's your relationship like with grief, or that grief now? Because I think that everybody listening to this is grieving something. We think of grief as black clothes on, someone has died. It's the part in the movie where we see them at the funeral, and that's when grief begins. And in my grief experience, I find that to be incredibly untrue. I started grieving, my most recent grief experience was my dad, and I started grieving him the second that I learned about his diagnosis, because I knew that I was going to lose him. And I allowed myself to grieve the whole way through, but there will be people listening to this who perhaps haven't gone through losing somebody incredibly close to them yet. We all will. It's what makes us all the same. But they may be grieving their fertility, or their youth, or their children's youth, or a dream, or a relationship, or a friendship. I think there are so many forms of grief, and I want to understand, what is your relationship like with grief now? As you said, it's this sort of ever-present
such
experience.
A good question. I mean, motherhood is the big one, right? We feel like we're grieving constantly. It's like they say, it cracks your heart open, and it's like falling in love 100 times a day, and also having a heart broken 100 times a day. And I think a lot of us, we really only start to grieve when we become mothers. Like, we might have had a loss that happened years and years ago, and we think we've completely dealt with it. And then, we give birth, and it's like, that's when we really begin to grieve it. And it's interesting for me, it's perfect timing, but also there's many reasons I wouldn't have wanted this interview to be this week, but many reasons it's perfect to be this week, because yesterday would have been my 17th, which is crazy, wedding anniversary to my first husband. So, and there's many years where I have not noticed that date at all. It's just come and gone and no feelings. And this year, it didn't get me on a emotional level, but it got me, like I was just telling you, I had the worst gastro. Like, my body was like purging. And then within that sickness, I just felt like, I don't know if you get this, but when I'm sick, especially when I have COVID, it is like the veil between this world and the next world thins. And it's like my husband, whoever it is like able to be right there. And it's something about maybe like your walls breaking down when you're sick, or you just like being in that vulnerable, raw state. But there's never a time where I feel my first husband, more than when I'm ill. And that combined with my wedding anniversary, like, it got me. And not in a way like my current husband wouldn't even notice, my kids wouldn't have even noticed, not like I was laying on the ground crying. I just really missed him in the last few days. And 17 years on, that is quite crazy to me, because there's many years where I would have said to you, I'm over it. Like, I have dealt, I've wrapped it up, I am good to go. But funnily enough, as I get older, I think I am missing him more, grieving him more, but not in this really like terrible way, in this actually like more loving, heart open, accepting way, where I kind of go, a part of me will never be over him. And that doesn't mean that I am not 1,000% in love with my husband now, and my kids and my life. And I can tell you, because I've thought about it many, many times, if I could click my fingers now and swap a man for a man and swap a life for a life, no part of me would do it. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I really miss this person. And I think I will be on my deathbed so thrilled to be going to see him. So this is why I didn't want an interview to be this week. I have not cried in an interview about this for a decade. But this is what grief is, right? Like, this is what we need to not postpone the interviews that bring up this shit. Like, because we need to normalize that, like, it doesn't take away from your life. It doesn't take away from me, like, having the life of my dreams right now, and the husband of my dreams, and the kids of my dreams, and the career of my dreams. but we can still say, like, I'm grieving a person, I'm grieving a thing, I'm grieving a part of myself, I'm grieving a dream. And that doesn't have to be a threat to us, our life, or anyone else around us. It can live in parallel with everything else that we are.
Oh, it's so beautiful that you can hold space for this person that obviously was such an incredibly important and special person to you. One of the things that I had served up to me a lot in my grief experience on social media, and it's so interesting because our job as journalists is often to synthesize these big constructs for public consumption, right? Love, fear, grief, purpose, motherhood, that's our job. And yet the real experience, the being in the weeds of that, is like the antithesis of that. And I notice in other people who are grieving, there are a couple of like these very well trodden tropes, I suppose. One being, you know, the first year is the hardest. It's the year of first. You've just got to get through the first year. The textbooks say with grief, we've got 6 months. And then after that, it kind of becomes abnormal, which, you know, most experts that I've ever interviewed completely disagree with that. But that's what the textbooks say. But there's also this, like, I found it quite comforting idea that nothing will ever replace the hole in your heart, but that your heart will kind of grow around the grief. And that's kind of what I hear when I hear you say that. You've got this incredibly full life and you can still be grieving. And I don't really know what my question is there, more an observation of, for anybody listening to this who is grieving anything, you can be grieving and have a wonderful life. I think that you're a living testament to that.
I was literally, a completely unrelated topic, I was researching for an article this morning, but I was learning about like the theory of emo diversity. So emo, emotional diversity. And that the happiest people on the planet are those that appreciate that we can hold multiple emotions at once. So we can be completely, beautifully, joyfully happy and grateful for our life, and we can still feel this sadness and loss. And I think that is the secret to me. It's when we try and like make it all one thing. I'm only happy. I'm only grateful. I'm only heartbroken. That is when we can instantly shrink down everything that we experience and pause our life there. Like, you know, if we're trying to choose one thing that we are, that stops us from falling in love again or pursuing another career path or having a different hobby. You have to realize that we are like multidimensional and able to experience so many things at the same time.
I'm really interested in, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this kind of chasm between information and experience, because as creatives who tell stories about our experiences, I often wonder whether or not my narrative of a certain experience is shaping my experience or whether I'm experiencing it. And now whenever I'm going through something, I'm always unwittingly or unintentionally viewing it through the lens of, well, how would I communicate this? And as I said at the top of this, I've always made sense of the world around me by writing about it. If I can write about it, it means that I can somehow package it into words and sentences, and then I can make sense of it myself. And if it finds its way into the world and that brings someone else some comfort or some understanding, then I feel like that's a really worthwhile pursuit. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about that? Do you write from the scar or do you write from the wound? Because I write from the wound. I've heard Mia Friedman say she only ever writes from the scar. Where do you write from? And what's your experience in that sort of retelling of an experience?
Me and all of the writers that I coach write from the wound and edit from the scar. So you sit down and write from the wound, you give yourself a break, you come back and edit from the scar. So I've got very clear boundaries. Like, people think that I write and share everything. I absolutely don't. I'm extremely strategic and have very clear boundaries about what I write and share. But I think that we do need to be able to write from our wounds, because that's how we collectively heal from the lived experiences of other people. You know, we don't sit in circle in villages anymore. We don't have that opportunity to sit with a lot of people and hear their story face to face. So we need to find a replacement for that, which for us is articles, books, social media, podcasts, whatever it is. But I do think that we can't always trust what we write from the wound. Like, we've all had those moments where we felt like the world is over and we're never going to recover. And that is beautiful content in its rawness, but not always the most accurate or hopeful or optimistic for other people that are reading it. So I also am very conscious because I am like a lifelong journalist. Like, I lay in bed and think of headlines and heads and cells.
Same.
And, literally I put myself to bed at night by writing articles in my head about whatever is inspiring me, or the conversation I had with a mum at the bus stop, or, my whole life is spent like a big jigsaw of listening to people and joining it together in an article. And I love it. But I can also cheat myself out of really feeling an experience by quickly jumping to how would I write this in an article. So even as I'm going through this, I'm like, what's the snappy headline? How would I intellectualize this in an article? What's the payoff for the reader? Instead of actually just sitting in it and letting myself feel it. So I think we can be too quick to storytell. I'm not someone who advocates live blogging your grief journey. I do a big part of my work is in helping people to translate their lived experiences into a product, whether it's a book or a pod or a TV show. But I don't necessarily think we should rush to do it. I think we should sit with it, live it a little bit, and then create content from it in the future, even if it's 2 months or 6 months, rather than let's live it today, write it tonight and post it immediately. I think it's good to write from your wounds and edit from your scars with a little bit of a pause.
That's so smart. And it's not just smart for creatives like us. This is, we live in a world where people are sharing more and more. It's a more and more public facing world for all of us. And there's such value in capturing those experiences, regardless of whether or not you have any intention of sharing them with anyone ever. That's so therapeutic. That's that kind of concept of storytelling for healing that I know that you're really big on. It's so strange. When my dad passed away, so my dad passed away in November 2023, and I'd cared for him for 2.5 years. And we had a doula who worked with us toward the end of that experience, whose praises I cannot sing highly enough and will continue to shout from the rooftops for the rest of my days, because I could not have done what we did without her. He was able to die at home. That's what he wanted. There's no way that I could have done that on my own. And she came over the other day, and we were talking about those last few weeks. We had a really tough last few weeks with Dad. He had really terrible, what they called terminal restlessness, which my doula described to me as this sort of last burst of life energy that the body is throwing out in a bid to survive. And what that translated to for us was we would walk constantly. So from dawn till dusk and well after. Some days we would walk for 10, 12, 14 hours. And he would shuffle along in his slippers because he had such edema, so swelling in his feet and his ankles. He'd shuffle along in his slippers and I'd shuffle along beside him, and we would walk and walk and walk and walk for hours talking. And she was reminding me of some of the details, some of the nuances from those last few weeks together, a lot of which I had forgotten. And it's really strange because I was quite diligent about keeping, not journaling per se, but keeping notes. I just, in the notes app on my phone, I slept at Dad's house sort of 4 nights a week to care for him, particularly towards the end. And at the end of every day, I would jump into my bed and I would just write down what we talked about, what did we eat. I wanted to be able to remember those little moments and what did we watch? What did he say? And I would write down, not word for word everything that we talked about, but if he said something poignant, I would write that down so that I didn't forget it. And I went back to read through my notes of the very end. After that discussion with the doula, I doubled back into my notes to have a look at what really was my experience of that time that she was reminding of. And the notes stop a few days before he passed away, the notes stop. And then I never did it again. And I feel really sad that I didn't capture that better, not because I want to go through and relive the gory details again and again, but it's that it just was a really interesting acknowledgement of behavior, that was really important to me up to a certain point. And then perhaps it was that I just allowed myself to be in it. That's the most generous interpretation of that behavior, right?
Exactly. And I think you can't explain that feeling, because I have a journal my husband was writing until about a week before he died. And there's no real feeling of flicking through that journal and getting to the page where the writing stops. And you just go, that was it. And to think you didn't know when you wrote that last page, he didn't know when he wrote that last page that would be the final page, and then the rest of the book is blank pages, is quite a strange feeling when you're flicking back through those books. But such a gift to have all the pages that you did write and all the times that you did share, and then to be fully present in the end without writing is really probably perfect. So I think there's a time to share, there's a time to write and intellectualize and journal, and there's a time to stop and just live it. And I've, been a journaler my whole life, but there's, years where I don't, especially when my kids were little. And I think that's just perfect. You write when you need to write, and you don't write when you don't need to write, and you've got to trust that.
Yeah, true. One of the things that I feel really passionate about, and part of what I want the Next of Kin platform to do, is to encourage people to capture their people, knowing that we will lose the people that we love eventually, hopefully no time soon, but to capture them. And one of the, I suppose, silver linings of having lost my mother-in-law in 2019, which sadly was very quick. We only got 6 weeks from diagnosis until she passed. And there was very little time to do anything in that time by way of kind of capturing her. But because we were promised 6 months with Dad and we got 2.5 years, I spent a lot of time interviewing him. We started Next of Kin together. I wrote, he wrote, we collaborated, and I feel so grateful to have him on tape, to have recorded his voice reading books to my children. That's one of the benefits of living in the time that we are in, is that we have the opportunity to capture people, and it doesn't need to be done in a way that's morbid. It's like, I just want some of you on tape. And it's so lovely to be able to have a snapshot of who was I at 30 or 40 or 50, or who was my mum at 60 or whatever. What did I think? How did she look? What were her mannerisms like? It's one of the beautiful things about, having a smartphone fairly permanently attached to our palms. I think we can kind of use that for good. Has your experience with your first husband changed the way that you approach any of your relationships and that side of things moving forward?
It's so funny, because one of the most popular articles I've ever written, I must have written it 10 years ago now, but it's still, I get messages about it all the time, was a piece for The Guardian. I can't remember the exact headline, but it's basically like, I deleted a lifetime of my photographs, accidentally deleted. So a couple of years after my husband died, a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years, I accidentally, through a number of circumstances I won't go into, deleted every single photo of him apart from 5 accidentally. So hard drive gone, computer wiped, every photo. So I have probably 10, I have a pack of printed photographs of him. And then I think I have 5 from our wedding, and like a smattering of others that had been printed in articles to publicize my book. And every other photo, all of our year of traveling around Australia together, are completely gone. And obviously at the time I was, as you can imagine, utterly devastated. But it's been really interesting, and this was what the article was about. Like when you can't live in a memory or live in a snapshot or keep poring over photos and photos of you younger and you with a person, how you have to actually like draw on the memories that you just hold in your heart, and also just not to live in a kind of like snapshot of what your relationship was. How you have to actually, like when I want to think about him, I have to kind of just dive deep and think about him and notice what pops up rather than just like opening a folder of photos and pouring through them and crying. So I have a mixed relationship with the idea of like we must capture everything in terms of images. I think probably just because I'm a writer, it's much more about let's write down. And I love when I'm working with my writers, I'm really about like the nuance of our experience of life and loss. So I kind of want to hear less about the funeral or the marriage. I want to hear about like those tiny little moments in between. Like, you know, I want to, like when I think of the final week with my first husband, like I think about like I can still taste like the bag of lollies we got from the petrol station on the way back from his last doctor's appointment, which we didn't know was going to be last, and how we sat in bed together and watched Big Brother and ate those lollies, and how I kept that bag of lollies for months afterwards and just carried them around in my pocket, the half-eaten lollies. And I love hearing those stories of loss and life and people, because I think we all know like the image of like I stand at the funeral and I cry, or like, you know, I'm in the hospital, he's in the hospital bed and the machine starts beeping. But that's really like a tiny moment. That's just a second or an hour of what grief is and loss is and life is. I really love hearing people writing about those little moments in between. And as a mother, again, those are the moments, right? It's not really to me the birthdays and the school graduations. It's like my 3-year-old getting in bed with me in the mornings and putting her little hot cheek against my cheek. It's those real nuanced small moments that I want to remember. And I think often even a photograph can't get them, but a journal entry or however you want to write it down or speak it out really does capture them for me.
It's so, so true. You know, one of the things that really stuck with me from The World is a Nice Place is, and it's so weird because I've heard it a million times before, as is often the way with messages of personal development, right? And it's write down what your ideal day looks like. And I've heard to do that a million times before and never felt called to do it. I'm like, eye roll. And yet it's been rattling around in me since I heard you say it. And what has struck me is that my current day is dangerously close to my ideal day. And I don't think I could have ever said that before. And I've felt kind of miserable, if I can be honest, I felt very lost for the last 6 months or so. I lost Dad 6 months ago. It's been really tough. You know, I've been in the throes of that grief and raising small children and trying to have a career and all of the things that we do. And it really struck me when I heard you say that. I really thought about it. Where would I be? You say to get quite specific. Where would you be? Where would you wake up? Where would you go? You tell this beautiful story about how at that point in your life you would drive 45 minutes to another cafe because that was the cafe that made you feel a certain way, and you sit there by the fire and you write. And that there was so much about that I totally aligned to. I think we're both these kind of introverted extroverts or extroverted introverts or ambiverts or whatever you want to call it. I thrive on a stage. My most comfortable places are on a stage in front of thousands of people or completely by myself with my laptop, not talking to anybody. It's so funny. But I think for anybody listening, it's such a beautiful exercise because it really opened my eyes to the fact that, like you say about your child getting in bed with you and pressing their cheek up against yours. I went and watched my daughter's edu-dance concert at her school today, and there is nowhere in the world that I would have rather been than there today. I feel so grateful I could be there.
With all the privilege of having the freedom that you and I have, you know, that like with the understanding not everybody has this privilege of being able to have so much choice. That it's funny, even again, like writing that before becoming a mother, obviously then I did have the freedom to drive 45 minutes to a cafe and have, you know, I wasn't doing school drop-offs and trying to be around for if the school calls to say somebody's been hit with a yo-yo, which happened frequently, and I have to go and pick someone up because they're crying. It's funny, like life does shift and change and we have to work within our means as well. but to like think about what does matter to us. And I think that is the gift of losing someone so young, is that I was speaking like of my little family message board last night, because my dad was paralyzed from cancer when I was 17, and he recovered incredibly and made this miraculous recovery. But he woke up one day went to bed one night, fit, healthy. He was a rower and incredible, and woke up the next day and couldn't feel his legs, and a tumor had grown around the base of his spine. And so at the age of 17, I really was like thrust into this realization that like life can change instantly. And it also like life isn't guaranteed. Like so many of my friends were just like, of course my parent will be around for 20, 30 years at my wedding. Like that was just a given. But I was, spent my late teens in hospital wards, like seeing my dad completely like change from this fit and healthy person to like an elderly man at the age of 50. But the gift of that is that like me and my sister and my parents, we really do kind of take life by the balls. And, like right now, my sister's cycling across England, and my mum and dad can't wait to come rock climbing with me when they come to Australia. And you have a high expectation of life, I think, when you've seen how fragile life is. And that can be the making and breaking of you. Like I'm sure you feel it. This pressure to seize the day. I know that mothers feel it because we're told all the time, it goes so fast, you must enjoy every moment. And I have felt the like aching pressure of that and the exhaustion of feeling that, but also I've seen the benefits of it's driven me to really go for what I want and create the life I love. So I don't even know how I started on this topic. I'm going in a circle, but I think my point was that when you lose someone particularly young and you see the fragility of life, it does make you think, what would my ideal day look like? And to some people, that seems very idealistic and even like childish, that you should think that you should have an ideal day. But why shouldn't we, within the constraints of like logistics? We should have a version of an ideal day because life is short. So let's go for it.
Yeah, I agree. Part of the challenge for anybody in sharing anything that they're going through that's difficult, and I think we're getting much better at that now, right? We're seeing a lot more people show up, whether or not they do it professionally like us or whether they just do it to speak up and be a voice for people in their community, whether they might have a child who's neurodiverse or they might share their own battles with a particular illness. I think we are getting more open, whether it's just within our little social circles, whether it's more broadly on social media or whether it's through, any whatever platform we have like we do. Part of the challenge of that is that you can kind of become the headline. And when you're doing it as a profession like we do, I have certainly taken the perspective in the past of, any press is good press. When you've got books to sell or seats to fill or whatever it might be. And I remember you saying something about, I think it was the Daily Mail or somebody like that had latched onto this headline about your first book about Wife Interrupted, that you were the Scarlet Widow.
Amazingly, I approved that headline. When I was, it's so funny to think back, but I was 23. I would have approved any headline at that time. I didn't, now I really hammer into my writers who come through my program, being clear on your boundaries, pushing back, saying no. I'm so firm with them about that, like knowing what works for you and don't just being steamrolled. And I wasn't steamrolled. I mean, I was also 23-year-old who's very keen to make it as a journalist. So I'm not going to feign dumb and not say that I knew the power of that headline in terms of clickability. So the headline was titled Confessions of a Scarlet Widow.
You were playing the game.
I was playing the game, and also I just didn't really care. Like, who cares? Like, and I still to a degree have that. like, oh my God, who cares if you cut off the Daily Mail calls me a Scarlet Widow? Like, you know, honestly, my first husband would find it absolutely bloody hilarious and be like laughing in his grave somewhere. So I don't take it too seriously. Where I do take it seriously is when it involves like my family, my friends, and that's more where I really try and guide people in my coaching, because like when I wrote my first book, in the midst of grief and just being young, I didn't really protect anyone else in my story. I kind of threw everyone under the bus with me. And really, I just cared about myself and my husband, and he was dead anyway, and he wouldn't have cared. And he also told me before he died, like, if you're going to write our story, promise me you're going to write it 100% honest, 100% out there. That was the way he lived life. But now, as a 40-year-old, I really feel like we can share these stories and have the same purpose whilst protecting the other people in our story and also our own vulnerability, especially if we are grieving or in the midst of something. So I really think that it's about putting boundaries in place. We don't have to live in this like #no-filter culture when it comes to content. We can share our story whilst being really clear on, like, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to talk about that person or that thing. Like, I'm working with writers now who have gone through incredibly complex experiences, but we're going to write their books in a way that doesn't involve other members of their stories who have their own version of events to share. You know, like how I went through my husband's death is completely different to how his family members went through it, or a sibling, or even my parents went through it in a completely different way. And they have a right to share their story or not. I don't have a right to share their story. And that's something I didn't do well as a 20-year-old, but I do it really well now as a 40-year-old. And I help other people to do it well too. So, you know, there are some social media posts I see people write. And whilst it's courageous that they are being out there and sharing their heart, I do cringe at how they don't protect other people in their story, even just from a legal perspective. You know, we're lucky in Australia. This isn't a very like suey culture, but you know, there's defamation laws that we have to be careful of. Especially, I'm working with a lot of women now coming out of domestic violence and family violence situations who want to share their story because it will help other people. And I am all for that, but I don't want them to be served a lawsuit at the end of it. So I really work with them to say, how can we write your story in a way that won't leave you more vulnerable, including to legal implications of sharing? Because we can't just go, well, fuck it, it's my story, I have a right to share it. There's like ethical and legal guidelines that we need to work around, which I think we've taken a great step forward in terms of let's share, let's have the courage to share around mental health and grief and loss and gendered violence, but we haven't quite caught up yet with like, let's look at the big picture of how we need to frame this story in a way that doesn't leave us more vulnerable.
I agree. How does your husband go? It's not easy being married to someone like us. And I say that with the greatest love and respect to us and also to them. And of course, you know, with things like my book or anything that I write, that to your point, I always have my husband read it first, make sure that he's very comfortable with what I'm saying, because it's really important to me. The relationship is far more important to me than any piece of work ever could be. And so I'm really careful, but I also am who I am. And part of that from a very, very young age has been, by and large, being an open book. And I find real comfort in that in other people. And I love being a light for other people to help them sort of step out of the darkness. How does your husband go being married to you, who shares in a similar way?
I think the best thing is, because I've done this for so long, like when I met him, I remember I was writing an article about the time about, you know, eco-friendly sex toys. So when I met him, I just had this massive delivery of vibrators come to my apartment, and we I was writing this very in-depth article about me road testing all these vibrators. So he knew from the very beginning that there is a certain level of open bookishness to me in my life. And he does love that about me. He also knows I am, like I said, I've got very clear boundaries. I'm quite strategic, especially when it comes to our kids and him. He luckily very sexually open, because a lot of my content is kind of sexually themed, and it's a real area where I'm very I'm very passionate about writing about sex and relationships and the complexities of that. And luckily he's very, very open with that. He also gets the benefits of having a sexually open wife. So I always say that if you complain. I'm well, there are upsides to it. More importantly, I think he cares less about what I write about my story and he cares more about how I live my story in our house and in our life. So in terms of how I identify or over-identify with my story, because we can, as journalists, there's a lot of navel gazing that goes on and introspection and over-analysis and kind of even putting ourselves on, a high horse in terms of, well, this is what happened to me and you need to understand that. He's very fine with me publicly writing, but there is a point where if he catches me being too wrapped up in my story in our life, in our house, he will call me on it. So it doesn't happen a lot, but I remember in the pandemic when we were in the world was in such a negative swirl. I remember it bringing up, especially because of health, and I have experienced health anxiety for obvious reasons. So the pandemic brought up a lot of stuff for me. I was pregnant as well in lockdown, so I was about to have my third baby. And I, for some reason, just started talking about my first husband a lot in a way that wasn't really, it was, the best word I can say is it was a bit manipulative. I was kind of using it to win arguments. I was talking about me and my trauma. You don't understand. This is what I've been through. You need to cut me some slack. And it was really interesting to see how, because I was feeling vulnerable myself and the world was feeling vulnerable, I started really over-attaching to the story about myself. And he called me on it. I remember one day this was 4 years ago, during an argument, he said, "You are so over-identified with your trauma." And at the time I was so affronted. I was excuse me, how dare you? But I went back into therapy and he was absolutely right. I think I was using it to try and make sense of the world. I was, trying to go back to, okay, this is what I went through. Let's use my perspective of that to understand COVID and the pandemic and lockdown and motherhood, and let's attach everything to this 23-year-old version of myself and what I went through. So I think he wants me to live in the present. In our family, in our home, he wants me to be in 2024 Amy. He doesn't want me to be in 23-year-old Amy. And he still gives me the space to feel what I need to feel when it's relevant. But he wants me to be present. And so I try to be to the best of my abilities, because I also think he deserves to have a wife who is fully with him and not in, stuck in a dream-like state of something she went through nearly 20 years.
Oh, it's so interesting, because one of the benefits of knowing someone for a really long time, like we do with our good girlfriends that we've known forever, is that we've often known them through all of their different iterations of who they are. And it's such a privilege to get to love someone through lots of their iterations. And I'm interested in editor of Grazia, Amy, and a term that I heard you use in The World is a Nice Place that I have never felt so seen in terms of the term. You applied words to something that I've struggled to put a label on, not that we need to label everything, but that I've struggled to put a label on in myself, and it has helped me greatly to be able to do so. And that's ambition fatigue. Tell me about editor of Grazia, Amy, and in the context of ambition fatigue, if those two concepts go together.
Yeah, it's so funny because speaking of my husband now, he just laughs at that version because he just doesn't know that version of me. You know, and not that it's so different. It's not like I'm like, oh my gosh, that Amy died and this is the new Amy. It's just we evolved so much. And I think I'm quite good at letting myself evolve. I have been, maybe I've had to be, but I do allow myself to change quite dramatically from, you know, a fashion editor who, like, I was just the workaholic, and I was also age, right? Like I was just at the beginning of my career and I was lucky to get promoted very quickly and get into fantastic roles really early. And I didn't have kids and I didn't have a partner and I was just like a go-getter, but it was also, you know, it's such a cliche of grief, but like a deep running from my feelings. Like I certainly hadn't allowed myself to grieve, hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge what had happened to me or what I'd seen or what I'd been through. And so I was just like desperately, I remember in my sleep, I would literally run, my legs would run in my sleep. And like partners would say to me, do you know that you run in your sleep? And I was like, yeah, I was just had to keep moving. And it was only, and you know, my body was telling me, like I didn't have a period for 7 years. I had my last period on the day of my husband's funeral. And then I didn't have one for 7 years. And then I came back the week I met my current husband. So your body is smart. It knows that when you're in survival mode and that when you're not, you know, you're not resting, you're not softening, you're not listening. It knows when you're doing what you need to do to survive. And that's nothing, you know, we have to be in survival mode sometimes. I'm grateful for that protective mechanism and it works until it doesn't. And it worked to get me to an amazing place in my career and to allow me to function in the hardest years of grief. But I couldn't have done it forever.
I feel so lucky to have got to spend an hour with you today. Thank you for taking the time to chat to me. It's been such a privilege.
Pleasure. Right before school pickup.
Oh, yeah. See? We're walking the walk or talking the talk or whichever one we're supposed to be doing. Walking the walk after talking the talk.
Off a bridge.
A very short bridge.